Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the next portion of our military history video. So we're here in the museum. I'm standing in our collection storage rooms, or one of our collection storage rooms. And I'll say ahead of time that the museum is lucky enough to be neighbors with our town offices, and that means we're also neighbors with the police and fire departments. So sometimes, and luckily for all of us, it hasn't happened today, police and fire department officials will go out, obviously, with their sirens that are needed, but that means they will surround us on all four sides with some noise. So we'll just take a pause if that happens. So I wanted to start by saying, as a reminder, the museum has about 70,000 pieces in our collection. You can see just a little bit of it behind me, as well as our photography studio where we take pictures of all the objects in our collection. And in front of me, you can't see it by the way I have it set up, but is a lot of different pieces that relate to the US military that we have here in our collection. So just a note on how the museum collects firearms and weapons and any artifact really. When these pieces are donated, they either by the original owner or somebody who's come into possession of it, whether it be handed down or they found it somewhere. The museum considers weapons and military pieces just the same as we do any other artifact, which means that we take it through our collections committee, which is a committee of community members and museum staff and volunteers that assess each object that comes in and make sure that it fits to our collection standards, which basically means it needs to have belonged to somebody who lived in the Kennebunks, been used here, been made here, or have an important story related somehow to the Kennebunks or Southern Maine. So for firearms and other explosive devices, safe handling is obviously paramount. You can see that I'm wearing gloves, and of course with my jacket today I look like a clown, but other than that, we always need to wear gloves when we're handling these pieces, just because they're, number one, they're old and we don't want to put any of our own oils and germs on these pieces to make sure they stick around for a long while. Number two, you don't want to get anything from the, any remnants from explosives or anything on your hands. So you just want to make sure that you're being careful. So when pieces like firearms come in, we usually call a specialist, most likely the police department. As I said, they're right next to us here, to ensure that the weapon is not loaded or armed. So we just make sure that nothing's going to happen here once it's in our collection. And as well, safe to handle, basically. There are strict rules outlined in the National Firearms Act, regulated by the ATF, pertaining to the regulation of antique firearms. So weapons created before 1898 are not regulated. So that means most of the Brickstore Museum's weapon collection right now falls into this category, because we have a lot of Civil War and pre-1898 weapons. But as we get further into the 21st century, obviously we hope that changes, because we are always actively looking for pieces from the 20th and 21st centuries, basically. So we're going to try to go in order of military history, as we did in our presentation just before this. So first piece is one that we have from the Revolutionary War. And this was made, this is a boarding pistol. Turn it around. This is a boarding pistol from about 1775. And you can see it has a lot of delicate decoration right on all of those metal pieces. There's the butt end of it. And then the top is really beautiful. And you can probably hear them. So the nails, unfortunately, are coming up from the body of it. So this was made in England, and it's a flintlock pistol, obviously. You can see here by the mechanism. It's also called the Dragoon Pistol. Sorry for pointing that at you. And it was common amongst most British and colonial troops at the time. This one just happens to be really decorated in a nice way. This was, and you probably in my passing, you could see the number that we have painted on there. We can tell by that number that it was one of the first objects donated to the museum because it's a really early number. It's actually a numbering system that we don't use anymore. So that's how we know that it was probably given in the 1930s or 40s when the museum originally opened by a family who probably had this from an ancestor who fought in the revolution. Unfortunately, we don't have that information anymore, so it's up to us to formulate a guess. This here, you would probably, a lot of people probably know what this is already. This is a bayonet. You can see it hooks onto a firearm by this little locking mechanism. And it's tri-cornered, so you can see the triangle there. It's an iron bayonet, and it was found on the Merrill property on Old River Road in Arundel in 1969. It's attributed to being used in the Revolution when bayonets were incredibly useful when fighting against the enemy, simply because firearms were not that useful and not that they didn't aim very well, basically. So this piece was one of only a few bayonets that were ever manufactured in the colonies instead of in Britain. And it's about 15 inches long, so you wouldn't want to be run into by that. All right, now we have some pieces from the Civil War. And I hope you excuse me looking down, but I need notes on these sorts of things because I can't remember it all. So if you watched our lecture on local military history already, you would have heard the name Seth Bryant. He was a member of the 27th and 32nd Maine regiments that went to war during the Civil War. And he had this revolver, basically. And actually there's a sword. I'll show it in a moment. We have both his sword and his revolver from the Civil War. And I'm going to try to put this into the light. It's very hard to see because the use over time has faded it away. But there's a little, you can probably see a bit of it. Along the back is inscribed, as well as the bottom. It says, presented to Captain Seth Bryant by his friends in Kennebunk, Maine. So before Seth Bryant went again to the Civil War in the 32nd Maine, he was given this Colt model 1849 revolver that was made in 1862. Should show it to you a little bit more. And again, like I said at the beginning, we always have to be careful, you know, when handling firearms like this. Of course, we always made sure the barrel is empty and the everything else is functioning. But the other thing you don't want to do, and this is an aside, when you're working with antique firearms, even when people come in and would like to look at them, the kind of automatic reaction is you want to snap this back to see what happens and if this rotates around. You don't want to do that because you don't know how brittle these pieces are, and of course something could snap off that you didn't intend. So you always just want to leave it as it is. So I mentioned that we had Seth's sword as well. So this is his sword. I'll stand back. With his scabbard. And again, I'm gonna try to show you, but right in this little area, you can't see it, I don't think, but right in this little area, it also says to Seth Bryant from his friends in Kennebunk. So he got both the sword and this firearm, as I said before. And the interesting thing about this, so again, there's a lot of decoration on the scabbard here. And then when you pull this away, you can see there's decoration on the sword itself. I don't know if you can see that in the camera. That one's a little more dirty, but you can kind of see it. It's a kind of a floral design with some hash markings. So the interesting story about these two pieces is that they came to the museum at different times. The sword was donated by a family member of the Bryant family, and then in the 1930s, so right when the museum was opening. But the revolver had gone missing, and then eventually the museum located the revolver at an auction in the early 2000s and brought it home to Kennebunk. So here it sits with its mate once again, which is really awesome. The interesting thing is, and I mentioned in our last lecture, that we have Seth Bryant's war diary. And at one point during his time with the 27th Maine, which again guarded Washington, D.C. During the war, but saw no battles, Seth Bryant wrote in his journal, I looked for my revolver to show another soldier and found that somebody had stolen it out of my trunk. I am sorry, as it was a present from my friends in Kennebunk. So if you, as I said, if you look closely, you can see that inscription both on the sword and on the revolver. So he had lost it at that point. So we don't know what happened to it as it traveled through time, but nicely it's here at the museum now. What else am I looking for? Okay, so next piece is, just want to make sure I pick up the right one. Yeah. Okay, so it's just the longest piece that we have on the table here. This is a model 1840 musket. I'm trying to get it in whole shot. So if I put this down on my foot to make sure that it's not hitting the floor, it's standing to about here, and I am 5'8", so you know, that's at least at least 5 feet tall is this firearm, and it weighs about 10 pounds. So I always try to remember or remind people that imagine walking into battle with this 10 pounds on your shoulder and walking a long way. So this musket, we've judged it to be about 1835 in its make. It was produced by the Harper's Ferry Armory, again, between 1835 and 1840, and it started its life as a flintlock gun, which, again, the flintlock looks like this, with this metal piece striking the flint. And then it basically the U.S. government paid to have these switched over to a percussion cap in the 1850s. The flintlock style depended on the open spark, that metal piece hitting the other one. It depended on an open spark to ignite the gunpowder, and then percussion caps did not depend on an open spark. You can see it's closed here. And that allowed this firearm to be used in any weather, as opposed to if it was raining out, which it does often in New England. These flintlock rifle would be pretty useless. So the government paid Harper's Ferry Armory to convert 27,000 of these model 1840 muskets to percussion style right before the Civil War. And this specific musket was used by Kennebunk's Captain Corning during his time in the war. Again, it's really heavy and really, really, really long. You probably heard that thud. That was me putting it back on the table here. This is a saber. The handle is loose, so I'm going to try to be very careful with it. You can see it's disconnected there. So you can see how this blade is curved more than, for instance, Seth Bryant's sword that I just held up, which was straight across. And if anybody ever wonders why there are sabers versus swords, I mean, there's a lot of reasons, but one of those reasons is because in 1840, this was called a light artillery saber, And it was used by the mounted cavalry, so soldiers riding on horses during the Civil War. And the curved shape allowed those soldiers to slash at enemies who were standing on the ground as they were high above on horseback. So that was more easy to do as opposed to kind of a straight sword that you feel like you're a robot with. So curved sword it is. We don't know who that belonged to. We just do know that it was a main cavalry soldier, but other than that, there was no history that came with it, unfortunately. So this is another percussion cap rifle, this time made about 20 years later in 1860. It is not as long as it's not as long as the other gun, but pretty long. It's probably about it's probably about 8 inches shorter, by my judgment anyway. And this belonged to a man named Naval Ensign John Clement Lord. He took part on something called the assault at Fort Fisher in North Carolina on January 5th, 1865. John Lord lived here in Kennebunk, and as he disembarked the ship and landed on the ground at Fort Fisher, he found this musket that basically had belonged to a Confederate soldier, and that soldier apparently had dropped it and ran. And as soldiers sometimes do and continue to do, those who are veterans might have something of your own that you picked up. He took it as a souvenir of the battle. And he wrote on this, the reason we know is because he wrote on it, on the butt of the gun. It says Fort Fisher, January, I'm going to try to read this backward, January 15th, 1865, and then his initials at the bottom. So he had that painted on there. Again, this is made of steel and wood, and I'll repeat again that it weighs about 10 pounds. So imagining trying to carry this, running, walking for miles and miles, this is a lot. It's a workout, that's for sure. I'm gonna turn it around. I didn't show you an up close of that actually, so here you are. I have to say this one is a much better looking firearm and less beat up than the one that I was showing you before. Perhaps because he probably hung it on his wall once he got home and didn't use it. So another interesting artifact is a cannonball. So I don't know about anybody else, but I always imagine cannonballs before getting here to the museum about this big. This is a Civil War cannonball. Don't want to drop it. Again, a very early number. You can see it's pasted on there. So we know this came to the museum really early in its life. And it's made of iron and weighs about 1 pound. So it's very heavy for its size. This type of cannonball was known as grape shot, which was used during the Civil War. And it basically went in, a number of these iron balls would go into the cannon and then be shot all together as projectiles. And then it was unfortunately devastatingly effective in what it did, or what it intended to do, because you can imagine a bunch of these flying at a line of infantrymen on the opposite side. Firing these into a crowd is devastating. So those were pretty useful during the war. Last item I want to show from the Civil War, and I mentioned this in our lecture before, in our PowerPoint lecture. This is one of the medals of honor that we have here at the museum that belong to the 27th Maine Regiment, who, again, the quick story is they agreed to stay in Washington, D.C. to defend the Capitol against any kind of outlying fighting outside of Gettysburg. So they all earned medals of honor. And of course, in the Purge of 1917, the government asked for those medals back and said that those basically they didn't count anymore. And as I said in my other video, it is unsurprising that almost none of the soldiers returned their medals of honor. So that's why we have a couple here at the museum. This one belonged to Horace Burbank. And again, I can't get it close enough, I don't think, to the, there you go. Maybe you can see it there. So Horace Burbank carved his name into the back of that. It says the Congress to Horace H. Burbank, Sergeant 27th Maine. So here's the front of it. And then I'll show you the rest. It's a really neat piece. And as I said, we have quite several of these belonging to different soldiers from the 27th Maine that happened to keep them after the war. And nicely, they found their way here to the museum. So now we move on to the Spanish-American War. I didn't talk about that in my last video, but this is a shell casing, an artillery shell casing. And you can see it has this really long kind of inscribed narrative, basically on the side of this shell casing. Can't see much in there. But it's pretty large and echoes apparently. It's from 1898. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company made this shell to encase explosives fired from a 6-pound gun during the Spanish-American War. So specifically this shell, and this is what it says in this little inscribed metal piece, was fired by Ensign Bowers of Kennebunk on the gunboat USS Osceola during a battle at Manzanillo, Cuba, on August 12th, 1898. So we have it here in his memory. I'll hold this one up before that. This is from World War I, but it's also a shell casing. And you can see that somebody, the owner of the shell casing, bent the top out to make it a vase. And that was kind of a common occurrence with artillery shells after at least the Spanish-American War beginning, so basically beginning of the 20th century, for soldiers to take artillery shell casings and make artwork out of it. So if you ever Google artillery shell casings artwork, you'll find quite a few creative examples of soldiers doing that. So this always scares people the most, I think, when we show this. We'll go into World War I, as I just mentioned it. This is an MK1 grenade. And as you are all probably noticing, the pin is still in there. I'll say at the forefront, and as I mentioned at the very beginning of our video, we have specialists come and check these. And we've had this one done several times just because it makes all of us nervous, even though we know the truth, to even hold this. You can probably see this, you know, kind of sweat coming off of my face. This is a dud. It never functioned properly, and that's why the donor had it in their house and then decided to give it to us. So as I said, this is a World War I hand grenade donated to the museum by historian Kenneth Joy. He was a local historian. And is called a fragmentation hand grenade that was used by US forces in 1917 in World War I. So when America joined World War I, they actually lacked hand grenades. And in early 1917, the MK1, which is what this is, up close shot. The MK1 was created. Its designers called it the most foolproof grenade ever made, which is always promising. Soon after, however, soldiers reported major issues with the weapon in the field, and it was retired from service before the war ended. So this is why probably this one's a dud, and it now sits in the museum's collection. I will say that most of us, as we go by where it is stored, you tiptoe a little bit lighter, even with the comfort of knowing that it is not explosive. But just seeing a grenade on the shelf makes you go a little bit, tread a little bit lightly. So we move on to World War II. I feel like I had another one. Oh, I did. So this one is not on my list, but I just took this out because this is a recent donation. It's a gas mask. So this is a metal canister, has all the directions you need in this card. And then unfortunately, the way it was stored before, the leather basically that makes up the mask has kind of hardened in this way. So that's why it looks the way it does. But you can see it has some printing right on the front of it. It says big number 3, and then those orange kind of glasses that go along with it, and the strapping for your head, and then big metal canister. So it's kind of scary to look at nowadays anyway. All right, so I was going to World War II. This is a ceremonial sword that belonged to a man named Frank D. Lord, and he lived here in Kennebunk as well. And he spent his time in the Navy during World War II. And the interesting thing is, so again, the decorative pieces on the scabbard of the sword, and you have this white handle, which is beautiful. This little ornamentation here. And if you look at it really closely, it's an eagle coming around. So its little beak and face are there. Oops. And if I can take it out carefully, I'll flip it around. So on this one, you can see it actually does say, or I don't know if you can see it, it says Frank D. Lord on it, basically, right here. And then on the other side, again with the kind of floral decoration all the way down, which is pretty awesome. So the interesting thing to me is this is Seth Bryant's sword from 1865, and this is Frank Lord's sword from 1945. And they look pretty similar. I mean, you can't get that much different in swords, but it's just kind of funny how they both look pretty similar from the outset. Last piece that I'm going to show is it's our most recent donation, weapons donation, I should say. And it's from 1942. So as I said at the very beginning, there are regulations that regulate antique firearms pre-1898, and then those that regulate them afterwards. So this is one of the only firearms. We actually have a revolver as well that's from the 1950s that does not belong to military history. It's just an everyday revolver. Or a private use revolver that's come into our collection. So this one came in 2017. It was actually a gift of the Weber Lafay American Legion post. And you can see it has a bayonet on the front of it. It can be taken off, but we've left it on with its own little scabbard so nobody gets hurt. There's a sight on it right in the middle there. And then there's how you load the rifle. So the interesting thing about this is when it came in, it was assumed that this was a American gun, basically. It looks basically like a Springfield rifle that the US military would have used around 1940. But as we learned the story of it, we figured out it is not that gun. This was found on the battlefields of the Pacific Theater in World War II by a Kennebunk soldier named Leo Briscard. And it's called an Arasaka Type 99. So you can probably know where I'm going with this. Like I said, it looks like a Springfield rifle that the US military used during the war. It's pretty lean. It's just a straightforward firearm. So then we started noticing these very, very, you can see how you can see that. So right where I'm pointing, there's some characters basically carved into this little area. I don't know if I can get it close enough so you can see it. Yep, there it is. So if you look closely at the top, like I was showing you, you can see the imperial seal, which is partially defaced actually, and the Japanese lettering that's stamped onto this metal piece. So we looked up, or we researched what that lettering meant, and we were able to figure out where it came from, when it was made, and what city in Japan it was made in. So that was pretty impressive. Again, it was a type of rifle, an official weapon of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy during World War II. So like our story from John Clement Lord, who picked up his rifle at Fort Fisher from the Confederates and brought it home as a souvenir. Leo Briscard also picked this up and brought it home as a souvenir. So our only World War II firearm actually ends up being a Japanese firearm. So that is all that we have for now. But as I say, and as I said in my last lecture, I want to thank everybody who served and continues to serve the United States. That is a huge sacrifice that most of us wouldn't be brave enough to do. So thank you. And again, I'll put it out there that we're always looking for, whether it be artifacts like I was just showing, or stories or pictures of your family members and ancestors that took part in wars in America's history. Those are really important local stories and really important national stories as well. So if you know of any, please get in touch with me. Our general mailbox is info@brickstoremuseum.org. My email is cwalker@brickstoremuseum.org, and we will see you soon in our next video. Thanks, everybody.